The captain's hands went limp on the controls and his body slumped forward against the harness, and in that single terrifying moment First Officer Sarah Chin realized she was alone in the cockpit of Flight 447 with 217 souls depending on her and a captain who had just suffered what looked like a massive heart attack at 30,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean. She grabbed the radio with shaking hands and started to call for help when a calm voice behind her said words that made no sense. A woman's voice speaking with absolute authority saying Viper 1 ready for immediate cockpit assistance, requesting permission to enter. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. Sarah spun around in her seat and saw a passenger standing in the cockpit doorway, a woman maybe 40 years old with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing jeans and a gray hoodie that said Colorado on the front, looking completely out of place in the chaos of emergency lights and warning alarms. Sarah's first thought was to tell her to get back to her seat immediately. This was a restricted area and they had protocols and procedures. But something in the woman's eyes stopped her, something that looked like complete confidence mixed with the kind of calm that only came from facing death before and walking away. The woman stepped into the cockpit without waiting for permission and moved to the captain's side, checking his pulse and breathing while Sarah sat frozen trying to process what was happening. The woman looked at Sarah and said in that same calm voice, "I'm Lieutenant Colonel Diana Torres, call sign Viper 1, United States Air Force retired, 15,000 flight hours including combat time in F-22 and F-35 aircraft, and your captain is having a cardiac event and needs immediate medical attention, but first we need to stabilize this aircraft and get everyone on the ground safely." Sarah's brain finally caught up with her situation and she stammered that they were over the Atlantic Ocean 3 hours from land in any direction. They had no autopilot because it had malfunctioned 20 minutes ago, which was why the captain had been flying manually, and now she was alone with a dying pilot and a passenger claiming to be a fighter pilot. Diana looked at the instrument panel and said, "You're not alone anymore, I'm here and I can fly this aircraft, but I need you to trust me and do exactly what I say starting right now." Sarah had been a commercial pilot for 6 years and had trained for every emergency scenario the airline could think of, but nobody had ever trained her for the moment when a retired fighter pilot showed up in her cockpit offering to save the day. She looked at Captain Morrison slumped in his seat and she looked at the endless ocean below them and she looked at Diana Torres standing there with absolute certainty in her eyes, and she made a decision that would either save 217 lives or end her career in the worst possible way. She said, "What do you need me to do?" And Diana immediately started giving orders like she had been born to command in crisis situations. She told Sarah to get on the radio and declare a medical emergency, tell air traffic control they needed priority vectors to the nearest suitable airport and needed emergency medical standing by, then help her get the captain out of his seat and into the passenger cabin where the flight attendants could start CPR. Sarah transmitted the emergency while Diana unbuckled the captain and started pulling him backward, and together they got him through the cockpit door where 2 flight attendants took over and started chest compressions. Diana slid into the captain's seat and her hands moved over the controls like she was greeting old friends, checking airspeed and altitude and fuel status and engine performance in a smooth sequence that took maybe 5 seconds. She looked at Sarah and said, "I need you to brief me on aircraft status, any systems failures, current flight plan, fuel remaining, and weather at potential diversion airports. Go fast but be accurate." Sarah pulled herself together and started reading off the information while Diana's hands made small adjustments to their heading and altitude, keeping the big Airbus stable while she processed the situation. Sarah finished her brief and Diana nodded and said, "Okay, here's what we're going to do. Lajes Field in the Azores is our best option. It's a Portuguese Air Force base with a long runway and full emergency services. It's 200 miles southeast and we can make it in about 25 minutes if we start descending now and increase our speed." Sarah said that Lajes was a military base and they couldn't just land there without permission, and Diana smiled for the first time and said, "Trust me, when Viper 1 calls for emergency landing clearance at a NATO base, they clear the runway and roll out the red carpet. Now get on the radio and make it happen." Sarah called air traffic control and relayed their intention to divert to Lajes Field, and the controller came back immediately saying Lajes was standing by for their emergency and had cleared them for straight-in approach to runway 15, medical teams were being positioned and the base commander himself was monitoring the situation. Diana began a smooth descent, bringing the nose down and increasing their speed, and Sarah watched in amazement as this woman who had been sitting in coach 20 minutes ago flew the Airbus like she had been doing it her whole life. Diana caught her looking and said, "I know what you're thinking, how does a fighter pilot know how to fly a commercial aircraft?" And the answer is physics are physics and an airplane is an airplane. The instruments are different but the principles are the same, and I've been flying since I was 16 years old, so this is just another day in the office. She adjusted their descent rate and said, "Besides, I did my homework. When I fly commercial I always study the aircraft type before the flight, emergency procedures, systems operation, performance characteristics, just in case something like this happens." Sarah asked, "Does this happen a lot, retired fighter pilots having to take over commercial flights?" And Diana laughed and said, "First time for me, but I had an instructor once who said the day you stop preparing for the worst case scenario is the day the worst case scenario finds you, so I prepare for everything." She glanced at the navigation display and said, 20 minutes to Lodges, how's the captain doing back there?" Sarah called the senior flight attendant and got an update that Captain Morrison was alive but unconscious. They were maintaining CPR and had the aircraft's medical kit deployed. A doctor from the passenger cabin was assisting and said the captain needed advanced cardiac care as soon as possible. Diana acknowledged the information and told Sarah to inform the flight attendants to prepare the cabin for landing. They would be on the ground in less than 20 minutes and it might be a firm arrival because she was going to fly this approach like a combat landing, fast and steep to get them down quickly. Sarah made the announcement to the passengers that they were diverting to Lodges Field due to a medical emergency with the captain. They would be landing shortly, and everyone should follow crew instructions for landing preparation. She could hear the fear in her own voice, but Diana reached over and put a hand on her shoulder and said, "Hey, you're doing great. I know this is scary, but we're going to get everyone down safely. I've landed in worse conditions with aircraft that were literally falling apart. This is a beautiful airplane in perfect condition and we have plenty of runway ahead. Just stay with me and keep doing your job." They were descending through 15,000 feet when Sarah noticed something on the instrument panel that made her heart sink. The number 2 engine was showing fluctuating oil pressure and the temperature was climbing into the red zone. She pointed it out to Diana, who studied the gauges for a moment and then calmly reached up and shut down the number 2 engine, securing the fuel and hydraulics and rebalancing the aircraft's systems to compensate for the asymmetric thrust. Sarah said, "We just lost an engine," and Diana said, "No, we just shut down a sick engine before it could cause bigger problems. We have 3 engines left and only need 1 to land safely. This aircraft is designed to fly on a single engine if necessary. We're fine." She adjusted the rudder trim to compensate for the thrust imbalance and said, "See, still flying straight and level, still making our approach, still getting everyone home, just another variable in the equation." But Sarah could see the stress indicators increasing. The remaining engines were working harder to maintain their speed and altitude, and they were still 100 miles from Lodges with a sick captain and 217 terrified passengers and a stranger flying the airplane based on nothing but her word that she knew what she was doing. Sarah said, "How do I know you can really do this? How do I know you're really who you say you are?" And Diana said, "Fair question. Call Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii, ask for the 19th Fighter Squadron Operations Desk, tell them Viper 1 needs authentication, they'll confirm my identity." Sarah made the call and got connected to a military operator who sounded skeptical until she mentioned Viper 1, and then the operator's voice changed to something like awe and he said, "Stand by for Squadron Ops," and a few seconds later a man with a deep voice came on the line saying, "This is Major Collins, 19th Fighter Squadron, who am I speaking with?" Sarah explained the situation and Major Collins was quiet for a moment and then said, "Ma'am, if Lieutenant Colonel Diana Torres is in your cockpit then you have the best pilot in the United States Air Force flying your aircraft. Viper 1 has more combat hours than most pilots have total hours. She's saved more lives than I can count. You're in very good hands. You tell her Falcon 6 sends his regards." Sarah hung up the radio and looked at Diana with new eyes, understanding now that this wasn't just a lucky passenger who happened to know how to fly. This was a legend, someone whose call sign was spoken with reverence by active-duty fighter pilots. Diana saw her expression and said, "I know that look. You just talked to someone who made me sound like a superhero, but I'm just a pilot who's been doing this a long time and refuses to let people die when I can do something about it. Now let's focus on landing this airplane." They were 40 miles from Lodges and Diana started configuring the aircraft for landing, extending flaps and slats and lowering the landing gear, each action smooth and deliberate. She briefed Sarah on the approach, saying they would come in fast and steep, touch down in the first 1,000 feet of runway and use maximum braking to stop quickly so the medical teams could get to the captain faster. Sarah said, "That's not standard procedure," and Diana said, "Standard procedure is for standard situations. This is a non-standard situation requiring non-standard solutions. Trust the process." The runway appeared ahead of them and Diana lined up on final approach, the Airbus descending at what seemed like an impossibly steep angle but perfectly controlled, airspeed right on target, descent rate steady. Sarah watched the altimeter unwind through 1,000 feet, 500 feet, 200 feet, and Diana flared the aircraft at exactly the right moment, the main wheels touching down with barely a bump, thrust reversers deploying immediately and brakes applied with precision that put them on the runway centerline with plenty of room to stop. They rolled out and Diana taxied clear of the active runway, following the marshal air signals to the waiting emergency vehicles. She set the parking brake and secured the aircraft systems, then turned to Sarah and said, "You did good work today, you kept your head in a crisis and trusted someone you had no reason to trust. That takes courage." Sarah felt tears running down her face and said, "You just saved 217 people?" And Diana said, "We saved 217 people, it was a team effort, now let's get these folks off the airplane and get your captain to the hospital." The medical teams rushed aboard and took over care for Captain Morrison, rushing him to the waiting ambulance with the passenger doctor providing report on his condition. Diana helped coordinate the passenger evacuation, making sure everyone got off safely and was directed to the terminal where Portuguese officials were waiting to assist. The base commander arrived and shook Diana's hand, saying in accented English, "Colonel Torres, it is an honor to meet you, your reputation precedes you, we are grateful you were aboard this flight." News crews were arriving at the airport because word had spread that a legendary fighter pilot had landed a commercial aircraft after the captain's medical emergency, and Diana tried to avoid the cameras but Sarah grabbed her arm and said, "You need to talk to them, people need to know what you did." Diana sighed and said, "I didn't do anything special, I just flew an airplane from point A to point B like I've done 10,000 times before." But Sarah said, "You saved my life and the lives of 216 other people, that's pretty special." Diana gave a brief statement to the press, explaining what happened in simple terms and deflecting credit to Sarah and the flight attendants and the medical personnel who helped Captain Morrison. When they asked about her call sign and her military record, she said, "Viper 1 is just a name, it doesn't make me special, it just means I've been doing this long enough to get good at it, any qualified pilot could have done what I did today." But the reporters had already done their research and were reading off her accomplishments, the combat missions, the lives saved, the decorations and awards, and Diana finally held up her hands and said, "Okay fine, yes I have some experience, but today wasn't about me being Viper 1, it was about being a pilot who saw people in trouble and helped them, that's what pilots do." Later that evening Diana sat in the airport terminal waiting for a flight back to the United States, watching the news coverage of the emergency landing on the television screens. Sarah found her and sat down beside her, saying, "They're calling you a hero?" And Diana said, "They always call you a hero when things work out, but if something had gone wrong they'd be calling me reckless for taking over an aircraft I wasn't certified to fly." Sarah said, "But nothing did go wrong, you were perfect." And Diana said, "Nothing went wrong because I had a good co-pilot who trusted me and did her job, because the aircraft was well maintained and had good systems, because the weather cooperated and the runway was long enough and the emergency services were ready." Success in aviation is always a combination of skill and luck and teamwork. Sarah asked, "Why were you even on that flight, where were you going?" And Diana said, "I was heading home to Colorado after a consulting job in Europe, I teach crisis management and decision-making to corporate executives, trying to pass on some of what I learned in the military, today I got to put it into practice in a way I never expected." She looked at Sarah and said, "What about you, how are you handling all this?" Sarah said, "Honestly I don't know, 6 hours ago I was just another first officer flying a routine Atlantic crossing, now I'm part of some crazy story about a fighter pilot saving the day, it doesn't feel real." Diana said, "It's real and you're going to have to process it, you're going to replay every moment in your head and second-guess every decision, but you need to know that you made all the right choices today, you called for help when you needed it, you accepted help when it was offered and you stayed calm under pressure, those are the marks of a good pilot." Sarah asked, "Will you teach me, will you show me how to be the kind of pilot who can handle anything?" And Diana smiled and said, "You already are that kind of pilot, you just proved it today, but yes, if you want to learn more I can connect you with some training programs, some people I know who teach advanced crisis management for commercial pilots, we can make sure you're ready for anything." She pulled out a business card and handed it to Sarah saying, "Call me when you're ready, we'll set something up." The announcement came for Diana's flight and she stood to leave, but Sarah hugged her and said, "Thank you for saving my life," and Diana hugged her back and said, "Thank you for letting me help, that's all any pilot wants, a chance to use our skills to protect people, you gave me that chance today and I'm grateful." She picked up her bag and walked toward the gate, just another passenger in jeans and a hoodie, but Sarah knew she was watching a legend walk away, someone who had just added another impossible story to a career full of them. Sarah sat back down and thought about what had happened, about the moment when everything went wrong and a stranger appeared offering salvation, about the way Diana had taken command without hesitation and flown that aircraft like she owned it. She thought about Captain Morrison, who was stable now according to the latest report from the hospital, about the 216 passengers who had no idea how close they came to disaster, about the split-second decision to trust a woman she had never met. Her phone rang and it was the airline's chief pilot calling to debrief the incident, asking for her account of what happened. Sarah told the story from beginning to end, describing Diana's actions and decisions and the way she had handled the aircraft. The chief pilot was quiet for a moment and then said, "You're telling me a passenger took over the captain's seat and flew the approach and landing?" And Sarah said, "Not just any passenger, Lieutenant Colonel Diana Torres, call sign Viper 1, look her up." The chief pilot did exactly that and came back on the line saying, "Okay, I'm reading her file now. This is extraordinary. She has more flight hours than most airline captains. Her emergency procedures record is flawless. If anyone could pull off what you're describing, it would be someone with her experience, but we're still going to have to investigate this thoroughly. The regulations are very clear about who can operate a commercial aircraft." Sarah said, "She saved 217 lives, doesn't that count for something?" And the chief pilot said, "It counts for everything, I'm just saying there's going to be paperwork." 3 days later Sarah was back home in Boston when she got a call from an unknown number, and when she answered a familiar voice said, "Hey, it's Diana, I wanted to check on you, see how you're doing after everything." Sarah said she was okay. The airline had put her on administrative leave while they investigated the incident. She had been talking to a counselor about the stress, and she kept having dreams about the moment when the captain collapsed. Diana said, "That's normal, traumatic events stick with you, but you'll process it and move forward, and when you do you'll be a better pilot for having faced it. Every challenge makes us stronger if we let it." She paused and said, "I also wanted to tell you that Captain Morrison is going to be okay. I talked to his family and the doctors say he'll make a full recovery. He's already talking about getting back in the cockpit eventually." Sarah felt relief wash over her and said, "That's amazing news, I've been so worried about him." And Diana said, "He's tough, he's going to be fine, and he wanted me to tell you that you did everything right, he's proud of how you handled the emergency." They talked for a while longer about flying and training in the future, and before they hung up Diana said, "Remember what I told you? You're already the pilot you need to be, you just need to trust yourself, and if you ever need anything you call me, Viper 1 is always ready." Sarah hung up and looked at the business card Diana had given her, looking at the simple text that said, "Diana Torres, Crisis Management Consultant Viper 1, with a phone number and email address." She thought about that moment at 30,000 feet when everything fell apart and a quiet passenger said the words that changed everything, "Viper 1 ready for immediate cockpit assistance." And she smiled because she understood now that heroes weren't always the people you expected. Sometimes they were just sitting in coach waiting for the moment when they were needed. 6 months later Sarah was back flying the line, cleared by the airline after a thorough investigation that concluded she had made appropriate decisions given the extraordinary circumstances. She was finishing a flight to Denver when she walked through the terminal and saw a familiar face, Diana Torres sitting in a coffee shop reading a book, looking just as ordinary as she had that day on Flight 447. Sarah walked over and Diana looked up and smiled and said, "Hey, I wondered if our paths would cross again, how's flying treating you?" They sat and talked and Sarah told Diana about the advanced training she had completed, the crisis management courses she had taken, the way she approached every flight now with heightened awareness and preparation. Diana listened and nodded and said, "You get it now. You understand that being a good pilot isn't about the routine flights, it's about being ready for the moment when routine becomes chaos, it's about having the skills and the mindset to handle anything that comes your way." Sarah said, "I learned that from you, from watching you take command and solve an impossible problem like it was just another day at work." And Diana said, "I learned it from people who taught me the same way, pilots who had been there before and showed me what was possible. Now you're going to pass it on to the next generation. That's how it works, we teach each other and make each other better." She checked her watch and said, "I have to catch a flight, but let's stay in touch, I like knowing there are pilots like you out there keeping people safe." They said goodbye and Sarah watched Diana walk away again, disappearing into the crowd of travelers, and she thought about how many times Diana had probably done this, stepped up in a crisis and then faded back into normalcy like it was nothing. She thought about the call sign Viper 1 and what it meant, not just a name but a standard, a level of excellence that other pilots could aspire to, a reminder that somewhere out there were people who had dedicated their lives to being ready for the worst day anyone could imagine. Sarah walked to her gate for the flight home and ran into her new captain, an older pilot named Williams who had heard about the Flight 447 incident. He said, "So you're the first officer who had Viper 1 in her cockpit, that must have been something," and Sarah said, "It was the most terrifying and amazing experience of my life, she just took over like she was born to do it." Captain Williams nodded and said, "I flew with her once, back when she was active duty, she was giving check rides to transport pilots and she put me through the toughest evaluation I ever had, but I learned more in that one flight than I learned in years of regular flying, she has a gift for teaching through challenge." They boarded their aircraft and Sarah took her seat in the right chair, and as they ran through the pre-flight checklist she found herself thinking about Diana's words, about being ready for the moment when routine becomes chaos. She checked every system twice, reviewed the emergency procedures for their route, studied the weather and the alternates, and when Captain Williams asked if she was ready she said, "Yes sir, ready for anything." The flight was routine, smooth air and good weather, and they landed in Boston without incident. But Sarah knew that every routine flight was practice for the non-routine, every smooth landing was preparation for the emergency that might come someday. She had learned from the best that being a pilot meant more than just operating an aircraft, it meant being a guardian of the people who trusted you with their lives, and that was a responsibility she would carry with pride for the rest of her career. As she walked through the terminal toward the parking garage, her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number, but she knew immediately who it was. The message said, "Heard you had a smooth flight today, keep up the good work, the sky is safer with you in it, Viper 1. Sarah smiled and typed back, "Thank you for everything, will make you proud," and the response came immediately, "You already do." She got in her car and drove home, thinking about the journey from that terrifying day at 30,000 feet to this moment of quiet confidence, and she understood that Diana had given her more than just a landing that day, she had given her a new understanding of what it meant to be a pilot, what it meant to be ready, what it meant to be someone that others could count on when everything went wrong. And somewhere out there, Viper 1 was probably on another flight, sitting in coach with a book, looking like just another passenger but ready, always ready, for the moment when someone needed her skills and her courage and her absolute refusal to let people die when she could do something about it. The legend of Viper 1 had grown that day, another impossible story added to the collection, but for Sarah it was more than a story, it was a lesson, a gift, and a reminder that the best pilots were the ones who never stopped preparing, never stopped learning, and never stopped being ready for the moment when three simple words could change everything: Viper 1 ready.